All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bob Cambrick. I'm the co-chair of APA Florida's Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Committee. The committee was created in 2019 by APA Florida, and we've been operating since then. We have about 28 members currently, and we've been doing training, webinars. We've done a survey in order to try to find out what are some of the issues and concerns that are out there regarding equity, diversity, and inclusion issues, both from the private sector, public sector. And we use that to create a strategic plan. One of the things that we've been able to do, like I said, we've been doing trainings and webinars, and we've done 30 plus of those and had over 1,700 different attendees at our various events. And today, what we're doing is, as part of Pride Month, we are working in partnership with APA's LGBTQ and Planning Division, and they're our co-hosts. And we have assembled some really great speakers to basically talk with you from their perspective about LGBT plus inclusion and representation, why it matters, and how to achieve it. And so with that, this is being recorded. We will upload it to our different platforms, including our YouTube channel, and make you aware of how to access that once it's available. And so I'm going to step out of the way. And what we're going to do is we're going to start the program today, starting with Dr. Petra Doan. Dr. Doan, I was fortunate enough that I actually met Dr. Doan when I was in grad school at FSU. I've known her ever since then. And just a quick overview for those who don't know Dr. Doan, but she's very interested in planning for marginal communities in less developed areas and has worked in Togo, Cote, oh, I'm going to mess that up, Cote d'Ivory, Mali, and several other communities, including Jordan. And recent research projects have examined the effects of tourism on local planning capacities, explored patterns of peri-urban development in rapidly growing cities, and describe the development of new towns in Africa. She's also very heavily involved in ongoing research on the planning for non-normative populations and the development and demise of queer spaces and LGBTQ plus neighborhoods. And so also Professor Doan is now, I should say, Professor Emeritus from FSU. She's been with the department for 33 years and is winding her career down there and retiring. And so the EDI committee is really happy to have Petra help us with this conversation today. I love having my friend talk, and I learn from her every time. And so with that, Petra, would you please go ahead with your presentation?
Thanks, Bob. It's great to be on this call with such a wonderful group of people. I'm going to share my screen and set up a PowerPoint. What I want to talk about today is how do we plan for more inclusive spaces? And I want to particularly hit the theme of going beyond the rainbow crosswalk. Rainbow crosswalks are great, but we need to do more than just slap some paint on the street. This talk, I'm going to talk about inclusive spaces and then how planning needs to be involved in this. We really need a particular issue, particularly for my population, which is the trans population. We need to be very conscious of safety in public spaces, not just for trans people, but I'll use trans people as an example. How do we provide support for LGBTQ spaces so that we can go beyond the rainbow crosswalk? There has been an epidemic of violence, particularly against the trans community. I grew up in Pennsylvania, and people talked about, where there were a lot of coal mines, people talked about the canaries in the coal mine. When the canaries died, there was a problem and you should get out of the mine. Well, I would argue that trans people are the canaries in the coal mine. They attract the bulk of the hatred and rage, and it's a signal that the entire queer community is at risk. Because if you want to bash a queer person, a trans person is typically pretty obvious. But if you see a non-normatively appearing gay man or lesbian, you go after them as well. And so we are all at risk. Where any trans violence occurs is any non-normative gender or behavior safe. This is the data on hate crimes. It's appalling. Again, in 2013, they began, or 2012, they began collecting hate crimes data, and you can see it's just going up. In 2019, which is the last year the FBI has released, there were 227 anti-trans or non-normative gender hate crimes. That's an appalling rate of increase. And given the way trans people are in the media these days, with anti-trans legislation in many state legislatures, no trans in sports, no bathroom bills keep coming up. Trans people are very much in the limelight, and the violence against us gets worse and worse. What's interesting, and this is for anti-trans hate crimes, but it is also, not that different than the lesbian and gay hate crimes. Notice the biggest category is highways and streets, which is an area where planners have some input. The next is residents and homes, this area here. That's less linked to planning, but then schools and colleges at 9%, parking lots and garages, parking garages in particular, 9%. And then 11, then we get to 5% bus and train terminals, parks and playgrounds, government buildings, jails and facilities. Of these spaces that are listed by the FBI and their uniform crime reports, more than 50% are areas that planners can influence. So these are public spaces, public buildings, public spaces, parks, streets, parking lots and garages. So, there are things we can do. We can't touch in-home anti-trans violence, but we certainly can have an impact on the others. So how do we do this? How does planning account for public spaces where there is persistent, what I would call heteronormativity? That is, anything or anyone that's different than the norm is going to be targeted. Leonie Sandercock, one of my favorite urban planning faculty members, always asks, who's the subject of planning? Who are we planning for? Are we only planning for the heteronormative population, or are we planning for those who are most marginalized? We really need to think about urban safety in a different way. Some of the most enduring models for safety come from Jane Jacobs, who, it turns out, I found out the other, last year, is a distant cousin of mine, or was a distant cousin. But her Eyes on the Street has become sort of the moniker that sort of describes how we should provide safety. But Eyes on the Street is a very heteronormative vision. Now, Jane Jacobs did a lot of really wonderful sort of rabble rousing, but her notion of safety, eyes on the street, requires friendly eyes. But if you are LGBTQ, people, Granny looking out of her front window may not say, oh, look at that poor trans person who's being beat up. She may go, hit him again, harder, harder. Many queer spaces are under pressure from heteronormative populations. And so this notion of eyes on the street is not adequate to protect our vulnerable populations. I'm going to look at 3 quick cases. The Castro in San Francisco, which is everybody's icon for an LGBTQ space. And then I'm going to go briefly to Midtown, and I'm going to end up with Montrose, which is a queer neighborhood in Houston. Now, in Castro, the Castro is a very iconic neighborhood. Everyone thinks about the Castro. The Castro it was a 19th century Victorian neighborhood in San Francisco. By the 1970s, the Irish working class had moved in, and then they began moving to the suburbs, looking for a better life, looking for, schools and bigger houses, and gays moved in and liberated the approximately 40 square blocks that constitutes the neighborhood called the Castro. And they decorated the streets with rainbow flags. I mean, I was there in early 2000, and every street was lined with rainbow flags. You couldn't not know this was a queer neighborhood. Unfortunately, that has been changing due to redevelopment. It's the iconic status is somewhat diminished. Is the Castro still gay? Yes, it is, but there's a lot less gay people than before. When I was at APA in San Francisco, GALIP, which was the LGBTQ and planning division then, did a tour. And I went on that tour. Some of you may have been on it as well. It was very disappointing. You know, we kept going down to the waterfront. See where this hotel is? There used to be a gay bar here. And then we went up to the North Shore. See where this was? This is where this used to be. Very little of the spaces remain. The Castro in 2005 still had a lot of rainbow flags. And so it was the queer space that remained. But by the time I went back to San Francisco in 2016 for the geography conference, I was told rainbow flags only are shown in the Castro during Pride Month, like any other city that's celebrating Pride, not as markers of queer space. There are some bars, sure, that are still gay. There are rainbow crosswalks, and of course, Harvey Milk's camera shop is still there. But the place itself is diminished. It's still there, but it's diminished. Atlanta is another case where we have had a lot of redevelopment. In Atlanta, the Midtown neighborhood was was a real center for gay men gathering. Initially drawn perhaps by Piedmont Park when it wasn't safe to go to bars. Gay men sometimes go to public parks to meet other people, to do things with them, which is their own private business. There were also grew up after Piedmont Park, around Piedmont Park, a whole range of bars and even an iconic bookstore, the Outright Bookstore. But the city had a different vision for this area. They had a vision that they called the Peachtree vision. They felt that Peachtree Street was seedy. Well, yes, it had a lot of gay bars. And if you're a city father, maybe you think that's seedy, but it was a vibrant community. And there, as I described in my 2011 article with Harrison Higgins, they did everything they could to drive the gay bars out. And what happened is the gay bars got shut down. They got sort of over-regulated, carefully surveilled. They built a lot of high-rise apartments, condos. Some gay people live in those high-rise condos, but it doesn't feel very gay anymore. It doesn't feel very queer. And so LGBTQ people began leaving Midtown, both because it was expensive and also because you had a lot of heteronormative neighbors that were sort of looking over what you were doing. And so people began moving out to Grant Park in the southern part of the city, to Edgewood, to Kirkwood. Many of these were neighborhoods that had been African American, and here lies the rub. We gentrify, we push the queer people out of the existing neighborhoods, and they sort of get squeezed out into other neighborhoods and create cascading gentrification, causing harm to other neighborhoods as well. East Atlanta is now perhaps the new Midtown, although it's gentrifying so fast that other communities further south and further out of town are becoming, East Point, for instance, are becoming sort of the queer spaces. So queer spaces are struggling to sort of maintain a toehold within the urban fabric. One of the things that happened in Atlanta, I should mention, is that there were no queer people involved in planning for any of the Peachtree redevelopment. In fact, I looked through all of the development plans. The LGBTQ people were not mentioned, even though Peachtree Street abuts the Midtown neighborhood. There was no discussion of queer people, and I think that was a great flaw. I was involved in a planning effort in the city of Houston for Montrose, and This time, I think we did it differently. A whole group with Asakura Robinson, a consulting firm, was pulled together of entirely composed of queer people. And I think this may be a better model for how do we do planning for queer spaces. Montrose in the 60s and 70s was a queer space. Mary's was the iconic gay bar that existed from 1970 to 2009. There's a picture of Mary's with queer folks lining it. In 1977, there was a gay pride event on the heels of Anita Bryant's visit to Houston, trying to drum up anti-gay support. So the community organized the first pride event. And that is the first pride event with some protesters in the background. Of course, there are rainbow crosswalks in Montrose, not a bad thing, but it's not sufficient. So what should we do? Well, we created this Montrose Livable Centers plan. We used only LGBTQ planners. We looked at where the pride events were happening in Montrose. We recognized that the HIV/AIDS epidemic in Montrose, as in Atlanta, as in Castro, as in every major metropolitan area, has decimated queer space. And that may be part of what has enabled these spaces to turn over so easily. But we really felt that an LGBTQ cultural district, sort of designating Montrose as a cultural district, and in our plan, we promote that, was the model forward. So quickly to wrap up, because there are three other brilliant presenters following me, how do we go beyond these spaces? How do we make safe space popular? Because the problem is queer spaces morph over time. They change, they fluctuate, they cascade, they move from one neighborhood to another. So some cities, as in Philadelphia, has created rainbow signs, but the gayborhood in Philadelphia is much less gay. So you've got these gay signs, but gay people aren't living there. Rainbow crosswalks are a little more portable. You can just paint over them if gay people aren't still there. Neighborhood markers, such as the rainbow pylons in Halsted Street in Boys Town in Chicago, also mark about 6 blocks of queer space in Chicago. But again, gentrification has meant that the queer people have moved up Halsted Street to Andersonville and beyond. So Boys Town is not really full of boys anymore. It's full of a lot of mix of people. There are still some gay bars. Rainbow flags, again, in the Castro, they're no longer there. We need to find ways to sustain this community. How can planning help? We should consider things like enclave protection measures. In San Francisco, they've used cultural overlay districts to protect Chinatown, but most recently, very interesting, to protect the Tenderloin district, which is a transgender cultural district. We need to limit existing housing for commercial redevelopment because affordable housing is also very important for LGBTQ people. Housing and cultural overlay protections are two tools that planners could use. We need to avoid special development districts to ensure fast-track development for big projects, because you can get big money that take the neighborhood out of the planning process. And frankly, we need to rethink the city beautiful. We need to embrace a more diverse vision of urban life and beauty that includes queer folks. We need to provide recognition for LGBTQ organizations as legitimate community organizations. When you're planning for a neighborhood, are you looking at Equality Florida? Are you looking at the local Pride Committee? Are you considering that these are important local community-based organizations? What kind of support do you have for Pride festivities, permits for parades, encouraging other kinds of public celebrations? And are you actively soliciting LGBTQ individuals for planning boards, citizens task force? Is there an advisory council for LGBTQ issues? These are all ways that queer people get more recognition. And then finally, my last slide, how do we support existing spaces? How do we preserve gay bars as community focal points? Often gay bars are seen as nuisances, but that's where the community comes together. How do we create and support more inclusive LGBTQ centers. So many queer centers struggle to survive because it's difficult to find the funding mechanism that makes that work. How do we preserve LGBTQ historic sites? So historic preservation needs to take play. And also, how do we preserve affordable housing for LGBTQ and provide services for the aging, for the youth, for people living with AIDS? All these services, these communities are particularly impacted. And also all of these things for communities of color, because queer communities of color get hit hardest, always by discrimination. So I guess I'll stop there and let the next presenter go. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you, Petra, again. Wonderful presentation. Our next speaker, and I'm really feeling, special about this altogether because I'm connecting with some old friends. And Nadine may not remember this, but I believe it was right after the March on Washington. I met Nadine at the Ramada Inn in Tallahassee, and I think it was the Family Tree, which was the LGBTQ community center was trying to get up and going, and Nadine was there and working on that, and I was hiding in the background and like being amazed by these wonderful people. But for those of you that do not know Nadine, let me just give you a quick overview. Nadine is the co-founder and CEO of Equality Florida, the state's largest organization dedicated to ending discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. A former award-winning journalist turned organizer, Nadine was one of 4 national co-chairs of the 1993 March on Washington. She was part of the historic Oval Office meeting between then President Clinton, the first such meeting between a sitting president and gay community leaders. She served on the founding board of the International Gay and Lesbian Youth Organization, which celebrated 30 years of existence in 2014. She is a Florida Chamber Foundation trustee, board member for Green Florida, and served on President Obama's National Finance Committee. In 2013, she was named one of the state's most powerful and influential women by the Florida Diversity Council. She was also given the League of Women Voters Women of Distinction Award, and she currently serves on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights Florida Advisory Committee. And also she recently received in 2001 the keys to the city of St. Petersburg. And just recently, she was awarded and named as one of Time Magazine's 2022 Time 100, the annual list of the most influential, 100 most influential people in the world. And Nadine lives in St. Petersburg with her wife, Andrea, and her son, Logan. And so Nadine, please, we are happy to hear from you and welcome.
I'm never late. That's a former board member for college, so it's always good to hear perspective.
Nadine,
There seems to be
you're
an
breaking up
audio issue.
Oh no.
Okay, that was better right there.
Oh, okay, great.
There you go.
Well, I'm just going to keep my phone very close and keep talking to you all. Conversation comes at a very interesting time in this work. Equality Florida is the statewide LGBTQ education and advocacy organization. And if you've been watching the news at all, the LGBTQ community in Florida has been at the forefront of a lot of attacks. We have the unfortunate reality that we are living in a state where two of our residents very much want to be the next president of the United States. One of them is Donald Trump, and the other one is the current governor. And because of that, everything that is happening out of Tallahassee is sort of viewed and calculated through the lens of positioning to see who will emerge as the victor should they go head to head in a primary. Unfortunately, what that has meant is a level of extremism in our state legislature around LGBT issues, around race, around voting rights and democracy, where the usual moderating voices within the Republican Party have been either driven out, compelled to capitulate, or aren't going to be seeking re-election. So it's a very difficult time. And one of the scariest things that we see happening in moments like this is not just the legislative attacks, but the behind the scenes elimination of the things that might sound the alarm. Almost like, instead of responding responsibly to COVID, just making it harder for people to get tested so that you can't track the numbers and can't quantify how bad the situation is. We're seeing these same kinds of things. So for everything that's happening up front and in the public view, there are about a dozen things that are happening that are really outside of the public view. For example, the passage of the Don't Say Gay, Don't Say Trans legislation that people are seeing is also being used to justify removing, for example, all anti-bullying resources that specifically provide support for LGBTQ young people. The Department of Education quietly removed them all from their, they took down all bullying resources, then under pressure, returned the bullying resources, but had removed everything that was specifically for LGBT young people. Again, that wasn't something included in the bill, but it hasn't stopped it from expanding well beyond the already pretty nefarious language of the bill. What we are seeing now is school district by school district, the removal of books that have LGBT characters, many books written by Black writers that deal with racism are being removed, being labeled as critical race theory. Even the book And Tango Makes Three, which is the true story of two penguins in a New York zoo who adopted and are raising an orphaned penguin chick. And it's been labeled obscene because the two penguins raising that chick are male. And so how does this relate? I remember when I was a reporter for the Tampa Tribune, we were doing a story that was a look back on how the paper had covered race over time. And so it caused me to have to read a lot of archival articles, particularly around race. And it was fascinating. It wasn't, I wish I could say it was shocking. But for example, if a white woman accused a white man of sexual assault in the 60s, they were considered serious allegations. They were reported as, allegations. If it was a white woman accusing a Black man, it was reported with extraordinary suspicion. It was reported as fact. If a Black woman claimed anyone had sexually assaulted her, the language that was used was intended to cast skepticism on her. And in reading these back to back to back, the subtle ways of saying that this is the in-group and this is the out-group, this is the group to be treated with respect and this is the group to be treated with contempt, was sometimes subtle and sometimes glaring. And it becomes harder. It's like being collectively gaslit in a community. And it made me wonder, with my 1990 eyes, how it was possible that no one called it out or that it could be seen as acceptable. But it makes me ask myself, what are the ways that things develop where groups are treated so very differently in subtle and explicit ways? So why is a book called Mama, Mommy, and Me challenged as being a book used to indoctrinate when it simply tells the story of two women raising their daughter? And yet every book that I ever read growing up or saw in school reaffirmed heterosexual relationships and families. I never saw anything that included me. And yet that wasn't considered indoctrination. That was considered normal. And so I think one of the things that's important is to begin to interrogate the ways that we create in-groups and out-groups and normalize a level of inferiority and superiority. So one of the things that we're seeing more and more of coming back around is this attention to bathrooms. There's a school district, I think Leon County may be on the verge of passing something that says that a parent has the right to know if a trans kid is using the bathroom that their child is using. And now you might ask yourself, well, why? Why would they need to know that? Why would that matter? And why should there be an interrogation to ascertain that? And it's the implication of it is that there's something dangerous and nefarious, even though we all grew up, in households, or most of us anyway, grew up in households where having unisex bathrooms was no big deal. It wasn't even a thing we contemplated. But this way of using the structure of our public spaces to imply something nefarious about a group of people shows up time and time again. And so my brother's a pilot, and as a consequence, my father gets to fly for free. His sister doesn't, but my father does. And he was talking about being in a place where, while you use the bathroom, with stalls that closed, when you left the bathroom, there was a common place to wash your hands, and how it was jarring to my now 86-year-old father. I guess he's 85, he'll be 86 later this year. Anyway, it was jarring to him to experience that kind of environment. But thinking about it, was it really that strange to him? Was there anything inherently, unsavory about that? And it prompted, it just prompted us to have conversations about public space and what we've been led to expect, and what feelings we end up having about it under different circumstances. I can look at I remember the first time I went to a place where there was a hand washing station for employees before they went back into the kitchen, and they said that we require our employees to wash their hands twice. And what I suspect is they knew that they would at least wash them once, and they'd wash their hands in public, and it created an expectation, or the confidence at that restaurant that those employees definitely wash their hands. Anyway, I don't mean to take us down this road, except far from the specific LGBT issues, except to say that what we are constantly bumping up against are situations where there is an assumption of who we are, and therefore, based on that assumption, we are treated differently. I remember back in high school, this was in the days where if you checked out a book, you had to sign your name, and they stamped it the date that it was supposed to be returned. And I looked up every book that had had homosexuality, bisexuality, anything. Didn't matter if it was a science book. I remember Front Runner was one book, and there was one other that was a novel. All the others were sort of research books. But here's what I did. I looked to see who checked them out, because that was my way of sort of outing them. And when I wanted to check them out, I would go to somebody and say, hey, I've checked out too many books. I'm doing this research project, because I wanted to make sure my name did not show up on that list. And so how different it is to have a system where the public cannot see that you've checked out a book, that you don't have that experience. How much different in talking to people from a younger generation who don't have that kind of policy, what a difference it made in what they were willing to explore and check out and read, because they weren't terrified that the simple act of checking out a book was going to out them to the rest of their classmates. So for us, it's all of these small changes. Some of them seem tiny and procedural. And I will use the Don't Say Gay, Don't Say Trans bill as an example. If you listened to the hearings on the passage of these bills, you knew without a shadow of a doubt what they were up to. The sponsors of the bill very plainly said, we think that schools are too supportive an atmosphere, and it has, basically allowed people to come out. We want to make it harder for that to happen. And in their view, being gay has lost its stigma, and they wish to reassert the stigma on being gay. They made no bones about what their intention was. The public opinion was not backing them. And so once the bill passed, they began to say, wait, what are you talking about? We're only saying that you can't have sexually explicit conversations with young people. Now, who would disagree with that? And as a parent of an elementary school kid, of course, I don't want teachers having sexually explicit conversations with my son. And in his 5 years of being a student, that has never happened. But what they really want is to create an atmosphere where it's harder for this to happen. I remember when we transferred my son to a new school, we were talking to his teacher. He was talking to a girl in his class, and I heard her say, if that's your mom, who's the other woman? And he said, that's my other mom. And she said, you've got two moms? And a teacher I had not met simply said, well, many kids have a mom and a dad. Some kids have two dads, and some kids have two moms, and some kids just have one parent. There's a lot of different ways that people make up their families. And I remember that little girl turned to that teacher and said, I can't believe you just had such a sexually explicit conversation with me and have caused me to question everything about my sexuality and my gender. Of course she didn't. She said, okay. And off they went to do something else. But the intention of this bill is to make a teacher nervous about that kind of basic decency, basic respect for all different kinds of families. And it is having that chilling effect when we see schools saying we are yanking books off the bookshelves if they have any content that we fear will cause our school to be the subject of a lawsuit. And just to be clear, they built into this law a provision that allows people to sue the school district if they believe something has violated the vague language of this bill. And even if that person is found to have no standing, it's a frivolous lawsuit, it's absolutely false, the school districts are not permitted to recoup their legal fees. So you have, or countersue. So it is incentivized, essentially put a bounty on the people who would like to erase any engagement, inclusion, respect for LGBTQ people, and incentivize people harassing school districts and punishing them financially without risking anything themselves. All of this is happening in an environment where we are seeing the erosion of rights at a number of levels, dismantling of democratic provisions to allow access to the ballot, the gerrymandering, the creation of the governor's own personal election police force. All of this as the January 6th committee hearings unfold, and we hear very detailed strategic plans that were put in place to subvert the will of the electorate, to reinstall Donald Trump, including plans by our own governor to participate in that process. So for me, in this moment, it is impossible to talk simply about the attack on the LGBT community. You know, this is a state where the Johns Committee, a state legislative body, created a committee that had the sole purpose of eliminating Black civil rights advocates and, quote, homosexuals from the Florida school system. They destroyed people's lives. They destroyed people's careers. They pushed people to suicide through their investigations. When Anita Bryant rolled around in the 70s, her Save Our Children campaign is using the same rhetoric of implying there's something inherently sinister about the existence of LGBTQ people. And she was backed by a group called the Moral Majority that at that time was not known for their opposition to abortion. Their main issue was they did not like that the Supreme Court had compelled the integration of private schools. So once again, we saw racism and attempts to push the clock backwards, and LGBT issues used as a political cudgel. And now we're seeing it again with the so-called Stop Woke Act that doesn't just limit itself to classrooms, it goes into private businesses and tells them, basically curtails the ability of companies to train their employees to work in a diverse environment. So diversity, equity, and inclusion laws or trainings are being considered a potential place that if you don't like what you heard, if anything makes you uncomfortable in what your company is training, you have the right to sue your company for its diversity, equity, and inclusion training. So I'm going to pause there and just say, right now, it's a moment where we have to have the ability to understand what is driving this, the ability to understand that demographic shifts, where we are increasingly a nation of older white people and younger Black and brown people, where no single racial group holds dominance. And yet, because of healthcare inequities and other inequities, the graying of America is made up disproportionately of white people fearful that something is slipping away. And it is driving so much of the polarized politics of our time. And it is affecting all of these different systems of government, of public space, of public education, of how we interact as a people. And we are at a crossroads of two decisions. One is one that will push us backwards, reverse rights, make us much more segregated and polarized, and one that sees an America where everyone has opportunity, where our diversities are not weaknesses, but our strengths. And that is the choice that we are making daily with the things that we do and the people that we elect and the choices we make and how we use our voices.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you again, Nadine. For those of you that are here in Florida, just a quick, just one of the things to let you know. Over the years, both, Nadine has presented at our state conferences for APA Florida, but not only Nadine, but there's an incredible team there at Equality Florida. They're a great resource. They were very helpful and worked with us last year when we were putting together information for Transgender Day of Remembrance. And we were able to pull together, working with Nicole, this very great flyer that we were able to share through social media. Another member of Nadine's team that I've had the occasion to work with is Ian, who's the Associate Director, I believe, the Safe Schools Program. And Ian also is a planning student at UF, but he also helped co-author an article that was dealing with LGBTQ youth housing issues, especially homelessness that's going on there. So when you start thinking about resources, reach out, and Nadine's put her email in the chat, but reach out to Nadine and her team there. They always have a kind ear and support and are great resources. And so again, Nadine, thank you, and all the great people that work with you at Equality Florida. And so now, continuing my conversation right now with, I want my longtime friends, I won't say older friends, my longtime friends, Greg Stewart. I met Greg, and I want to say it was the early 90s. Greg was working at the Department of Community Affairs in Tallahassee, and I was working for the Appalachian Regional Planning Council. And Greg and his partner, Rick's neighbor, was my boss on Hill, and that's how I got to know Greg. Back then, you could be a planner, but you couldn't be out. And so, we met through a social network, and then we got to know each other professionally. Greg has his master's in public administration from Florida State. I mentioned he's worked for the Department of Community Affairs. He's also worked for West Palm Beach. He's worked for Broward County. And Greg he's currently the executive director of the Broward County MPO. And so Greg is going to share his experience, his thoughts with you. And I can tell you, Greg is never shy about sharing the wealth of his information. So, Greg, take it away.
Bob, excuse me. Bob, it's great.
No, Bobby, if you know me for more than 10 years, it's Bobby.
So, just to kind of set the table a little bit, there was an old Bob Dylan song, "The Times Are Already Changing." And, Bob and I both, and Petra, as well as several others that are on, we've got to see the times really change. I went from a time when I was younger where Anita Bryant, and she's been brought up now in 3 presentations, including mine, she was actually a very bad person. And I do mean that. She actually spouted a hate that not anyone really should be ever speaking, and made a lot of us fear for our lives. Whether you were trans, whether you're gay, lesbian, it really didn't matter. It was, look at them, look, this is horrible these people are doing to their community. What are they doing in Miami? I grew up in Miami-Dade, so I had the opportunity to watch the parades. I had the opportunity to see the 70s occur and actually watch them flow into the 80s. Myself, I had a great education. I had time where I got to see what was going on in the world. I had a chance to go to the University of Pittsburgh. It was an awesome place. But Petra's right. That canary in the coal mine, this is what's happening again today. And as you listen to Nadine, and kind of it's one kind of depressing for folks that have been around for a while, but it's also your canary time. And so for those of you who are online right now, there's a whole bunch of things that you're going to be able to do. And a bunch of us that have been through this before, we're going to be there with you. We're going to help out as much as we can, at least provide you the verbal history of what happened. And as we go forward, I think that this is our time, and not to let it change to the reverse, and make sure that we move forward. That said, I live in the most incredible place right now. I've had opportunities because I actually kept on pushing and pushing, and I didn't care that the human resource officer at the Department of Community Affairs had Leviticus opened on his Bible sitting on his desk when I went to complain about something that I didn't get promoted. It wasn't that was ever going to stop me. I knew I needed to keep moving. I needed to find that place where inclusion actually did matter, where we could bring the subject together and move things forward. If you look at where Florida is today, it's a wonderful thing. We're at 4.6% of the population identifying as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. It is an incredible thing that we're at that. 886,000 people in our state, a little bit less than half the population of Broward County, is identifying in a way that would have been unheard of in the 70s, unheard of in the 60s. If you look at the total population that were in the workforce, those of us who are actually making a difference every day and have that influence with everyone, there's about 545,000 of us in the state of Florida currently working. Petra, now you're up in Maine, but that's a different conversation. The reality is we have this incredible opportunity to continue to make a difference in everything that we do, whether it's our day-to-day lives and our jobs. And I personally am responsible with my team members to create safe spaces. Petra hit upon it. It's like we get to do the streets. I enjoy that opportunity immensely. We are actually able to create places to make sure that they're safe, that if you're a transgender person, you don't have to fear the darkness, although you don't want it too bright either. We all feel that way. So it's just like, there's that balance that we need to find. What does it look like to have eyes on the street? Jane was absolutely right about that. We should be looking, but we don't want to be looking out the window and going, yeah, beat them harder. We need to be able to say, no, stop that. Be able to call the sheriff's office in. And our sheriff's office here in Broward County has a whole section that is delivering to the community that we all live in. That said, we move forward with projects that make sense for our community. Again, I live in a place that we're probably going to be the last in the coal mine to go. We're the bluest place on earth. We're actually one of the areas that all of our cities down here, I have 31 cities, almost 30 of them have equity officers that actually sit within their governments that make sure that people aren't discriminated against. Or if there is a call for discrimination, that it's at least investigated and made, brought to light if there's any background to it. We live in a place where we have a bunch of folks that are aging. And, Broward County's always been a butt of a joke, where it's just like, oh, where's the steering wheel and how can you see their hands when they're driving? But the reality is gay, lesbian, all factors of our community have to have a place to retire to as well. And we're not all as lucky as everybody that's online today. Not all of us are actually got an opportunity to get master's degrees, get advanced education. There's folks in our community that aren't going to be at the levels of socioeconomic that we're all talking about. So what we've been looking at here is where we're putting our residential units, affordable housing for our community. We created an area in one particular city called Wilton Manors. It's one of the gayest cities in the United States, population about 11,000, so that's not a huge city, but the reality is what it is. We actually had on an equity park area, we built affordable housing where the mean income of the retiree can't be more than $30,000 a year. Now, I want you to think about what you make right now and what that actually will mean when you're older and what $30,000 a year will actually bring. And that's a combined income, by the way. If you're in the community, in that complex, and you're making about $25,000 a year if you're a single person. So that connectivity from that location is one of the things that I kind of proud our organization on, is where we figured out a way to allow where the affordable housing could be built to connect to restaurants, healthcare, all of the things that those folks would need to get to and not have a vehicle, that they can safely walk and get to where they have to go. Petra was hitting on that, those eyes on the street. We actually take great pride in the bike lanes we put in, because you know what? Those folks that are in our categories, they're actually not able to afford cars here. In the ones that are younger, the folks that are working at the bars and nightclubs and so forth, they actually don't have the ability to buy a car and rent an apartment at the same time. So we're looking at taking care of that. Those are the today things, the immediate issues, the things that we get lost in while our rights are being taken from us elsewhere in the state. So that's an important factor as we look forward. That said, those safe places that we build together, that's our responsibility as planners. Those are the things we need to bring forward as we're doing our work. As you're doing, whether it's you're writing code or you're sitting down approving site plans, you need to be thinking about what your neighborhoods are going to be like. And not just what they're going to be like today, but what they're going to be like tomorrow. Petra hit on every cylinder when she was talking about how Atlanta, the Castro, my cousin Greg grew up in the Castro area. I watched that place change and change and change. We have to be ready for those changes and understand how to keep community character while allowing economic development and expansion to occur. And that's going to be a $64,000 question. It's hard to answer because you're also answering to an elected body. Typically, if you're on the private side, you're trying to get the elected officials to get your project approved. And if you're on the public side, you're trying to convince the elected official that this is an important issue and aspect to their lives. So I'm going to use an example of something that happened down here in Fort Lauderdale when I was younger. There was a particular nightclub. It was called Club Cathode Ray. It was on a street called Los Olas, which is now one of the busier shopping streets here in Fort Lauderdale. That particular club I used to go to as a kid. Ran it, 16-year-old, shouldn't be in a nightclub, but I was. That said, later on, it moved because somebody decided to build an apartment building on top of it. It moved further down the street, closer to a particular church. The church was so upset that that facility was there that they bought the building and then terminated their lease. These things are legal. These things can happen, but the whole idea of what we are as planners to be able to figure some of this stuff out is paramount in what we're supposed to be doing. The normative nature of what we do as folks, we go into communities, we fix them up, we buy houses cheaper, then we turn around and we sell them, move up market, move from one place to another. That's always going to continue because that's just in the very nature of what we have to do to survive economically. but we also have to look at what that means to those communities as well. As we come into a community and we redevelop a place, we need to make sure that the folks that are there have a place in that community. For goodness sakes, that's what we're asking for ourselves. So as we move forward, that's some of the stuff that I actually think you need to consider as you're doing your job. Now for the canary in the coal mine, and Nadine was hitting on it exactly. There are things happening right now that you all didn't realize could ever happen. I've been with my partner 33 years. We got married in California before it was legal in the state of Florida, before Oberfeld actually got approved. I'm sitting there the other night going, my God, they actually may take this away from us. What does that mean at long term? And it means it's really bad stuff that's happening. And once it happens, the things that you take for granted, like being able to get a job and get promoted and be who you are. The whole idea of being able to rent or buy a home in a place that you think that you'd like to live, all get challenged. Your ability to actually go get health care or be by your partner's side in an emergency, all could change overnight. Those are things that I used to fret about. Ricardo and I would sit there and go, how do we get through this? Living in Tallahassee, it wasn't like it is now. I'm in Oz as far as that's concerned. You know, you go to a hospital, you go together. They recognize your marriage. They recognize your domestic partnership. They recognize your being together. This can go away. This can all be changed by policy change, by legal change, by observations that none of us have faced in a 30-year period because we've always been moving forward. Well, the brakes are being applied. And now it's time to figure out where to head that. I actually am going to leave this over and then turn it back to Bob. And we're going to actually hopefully hear from Kat, which will give us some direction. Bob, are you ready?
I'm back. Yes, correct. Thank you. And my new friend, Cade Havoc. Cade is AICP. He's also lead AP. And he told me not to do an introduction, but I want to, I'm going to do it. And for everyone to know Cade, he is the National Technical Director for STV, as well as STV's Northeast Planning Director for Environmental Planning and Review. Now, the other things that Cade is doing is that he served as the chair and past chair of the LGBTQ and Planning Division, and he continues to serve on committees that support AICP. And Cade was actually recently appointed by the APA president to the National Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee, and also has worked in the past 2 years on as the chair of the LGBTQ and Planning Division's bylaw revision. There's a whole bunch of other stuff I could tell you about Cade, but what I want you to experience is Cade's thoughts about our topic today. And so with that, Cade, if you'll share with us, and after Cade finishes up, I'm going to unmute everyone, and then we're going to open it up. You can turn your screens on and be able to interact with the panelists, and they'll be able to respond to your questions. Okay, so Cade, go right ahead.
So thank you, Bob. That was much more the gracious introduction than I needed, especially now. I'm here primarily as a representative of the LGBTQ and Planning Division and APA, of which we're all members, but our division is supporting this presentation as well. I'm following 3 wonderful speakers, and I don't have content like that, but I'll get to my purpose in a second. But I want to just recap where we really started, which Petra, the stories of change are so important. They're important to our community, and they're important to what we as planners do. This is our wheelhouse. We are the managers and the facilitators of change. So even though we might feel a very personal perspective on how a community might be changing, we as planners also have to take advantage of our privilege as planners, our training, our education, our ability to reach people and help manage change in a way that's effective. And of course, Nadine and Greg and I'm not in Florida, but I am in the United States and I am part of the community. And, a lot of times when we discuss issues that affect our community, and when I say we, I mean we planners, there's a little bit of an element of kind of preaching to the choir, a little bit of, I don't want to say academic or philosophizing, because that's all like super part of the conversation. And so first, I want to say we need to participate. So just being part of a webinar like this, and being part of groups where you get to be part of a webinar like this is important, so you can have these sort of background conversations. And I've heard Bob's history and Greg's history, and Petra and I have crossed paths before. So it's nice to meet people and to meet Nadine again for the first time, and hopefully build some lasting relationships, because that's what I really want everyone to feel encouraged to do. Like, regardless of what specific lessons you hear today, or what specific philosophical challenges or political challenges you're thinking of, you start building relationships. And this is a professional thing, it's a personal thing, and it impacts the entire world we live in. And then I want to just remind us something that's already been touched on in everything we've talked about or heard about. Anger and fear are incredible motivators. I'm not saying let's use anger and fear to motivate people, but what I am saying is that we almost need a moment of silence right now. Vote. I asked my friends, what is the one thing as planners you want me to remind people of? Their capacity to make change. Vote. Vote, vote, vote. It's important to participate in the political process. And so often when we have planning discussions, we have to remember our ethical boundaries of what we're doing with this project and how it relates to the politics and the developer and the private side. But we are voters. So remember that as well. Now, my real purpose for being here is just to sort of hit on a few of the opportunities that people might have to participate. And I think I could even take a step back and recommend, there's so many changes happening in the world. And Nadine especially points this out. A lot of the conversation we hear can be sort of challenging. We might hear conversation related to gender as a construct, gender as a performance. We might hear something about pronouns. We might hear all kinds of things that are important and need to be discussed. And then we hear words like intersectionality and the idea that issues overlap. One community's issues overlap another communities of issues, and one person might experience issues from multiple different directions: economic, race, religion, LGBTQ, orientation, identity, everything. And so it's important for us to acknowledge that there's a huge conversation happening now that really, I don't think I could say that we saw this happening outside our groups, outside our community, outside the colleges or universities. And right now, if you want to know how to be involved in something related to EDI, to equity, diversity, and inclusion, you could probably go to Google, type equity, the name of an industry that interests you, and find organizations that have some way for you to participate. Now, planning.org is, of course, the homepage for APA. And if you type in equity, you'll see what's going on there. Some things you don't see behind the scenes. And this is true for many organizations because there's a lot of new activity happening. There's a lot of housekeeping. That's sort of the first thing that has to happen as this conversation emerges in a general and popular kind of way. Housekeeping. What policies do we have in place? What policies, not just specifically about identity or gender or sexual orientation, but what policies do we have in place at all, and how are they written? And so one might be surprised what one could find in different policies that have been written, and planners might have been part of it, good, well-intentioned planners. And there's a lot of language that's biased in quite extreme ways sometimes, quite subtle ways other times. And I realized that Microsoft Word actually has a feature. I'm not saying this is the only and the best, but it's something. It has a feature. If you click on check spelling and grammar, part of your grammar options are to evaluate opportunities for biased language appearing in your documents, which I think is kind of handy for anyone who feels uncomfortable in making a judgment. That said, comfort is challenging too when everything is changing, when the conversation is changing. And I think everybody should feel comfortable just being vulnerable. Don't need to know all the answers, don't need to be right about everything, but you need to care. And it's this idea of planners and this altruistic nature, wanting to do the right thing and help people be good people and help people be good to other people. And so we can do that when we participate in our community. Just one last and final plug for those of you who are members of APA. You're automatically members of chapters, which is a geographic. If you're in Florida, you have a Florida chapter of APA. If you're in New York, like I am, you have the Metro chapter, or upstate, you have the upstate chapter. You're automatically part of these. Anytime you have any question about anything related to APA, you can reach out to whoever is sending you emails from the chapter to say, I have a question, and they'll put you in touch. And likewise, there's also divisions. Divisions are not geographically oriented, but they're interest divisions. And there are some that are technical. Transportation, for example, or environmental planning is another, but there are population interests. Latinos in planning, planning in the Black community, and LGBTQ and planning, which I'm representing today. Join these divisions because you are meeting experts in all different kinds of fields who also share this very personal interest with you, which is, in my opinion, one of the best ways to make changes in planning in ways that you can be effective. Find something that resonates with you. And again, join a division. Anyone in any division will help put you in touch with other people. And you get to know people and you build these relationships. So with that, I will turn it back to Bob and just open this up to questions, because that's usually the best part of presentations like this. So thank you for letting me participate.
Okay, I believe that everyone, let me make sure. You should be able to unmute. And I'm trying to see if I see a raised hand. I'm trying to jump among the screens here. Or anyone that has a question, go ahead and start. We have almost 90 people here. I'm sure. I'm sorry. Let me try again to see if I'm doing this correctly. Okay. Well, try. Okay. Technology. If you have a question, post it in the chat and we can respond that way. For right now, I'm gonna try Petra. One of the things that we were talking about before, that we got started. What are the most active things you could see planners doing to better engage communities? Because we don't have kind of the neighborhood as much. And so one of the things is that when we're trying to plan for a community, how do we go about making sure that we're talking to our LGBTQ residents, constituents, and making sure we're hearing what their needs are, whether they're working in that community or they live in that community?
Thanks, Bob. That's a great question. So one of the things I think it's just critically important for planners to think about is that LGBTQ people exist. And in general, we are pretty organized, whether we are politically organized, whether we're organized for social networking. And so as a planner, if you are concerned with outreach to that community, the easiest way to do that is not just talk to your best friend who's gay or is a lesbian, which isn't a bad way to start, but ask them what organizations are they part of, and then clue into those organizations. Most cities have an LGBTQ community center. That's a great place to start. Every state in the country has the equivalent of Equality Florida. Now, I'm biased. I happen to think that Equality Florida is the best advocacy group going. But that's because I know Nadine and I served as a statewide board member for several years. But reach out to Equality Florida and they can put you in touch with local people. Or if you're in New York or Chicago or any other place, reach out to your local, Equality Illinois. Sometimes it's Georgia Equality, sometimes it's Equality Florida, sometimes it's State First, but there's a whole network of places. So that'd be the one place. Look for community centers. There are gay softball leagues. There are lesbian softball leagues as well, volleyball. There are gay men's community choirs. There are lesbian social groups that are really important. You can tie into all these. The trans community is not as organized, and it is harder to connect with trans folks, but there are lots of trans support groups, and so you can connect with them through that. So the critical thing is, this is a community that has been marginalized historically for all the reasons we know about, but we have input. We would love to communicate with planners. We'd love to communicate with you. So think about, how do you do that? I'll stop there.
Okay. And we're getting questions in the chat. Very quickly, anyone's available to answer this. How do you advocate for change in public spaces that are very much opposed or apprehensive about even acknowledging pride or queer events?
I'll take a swing at that one. I think, and I put it in the chat, but I think one of the things that is really important to do right now, especially in this time when there's a concerted attack, for example, in this idea of critical race theory, which is not actually what they're attacking, right? Critical race theory isn't being taught in schools. What they're really talking about is anytime you bring up the history or the legacy of racism in America, it makes us uncomfortable. We don't want kids asking what Pawpaw did back in the 50s or, where I was during this era. And so we don't want you teaching that in school. And so there's a phony kind of colorblindness that is being imposed, because if we speak about race, it is inherently an uncomfortable conversation. But I think it becomes even more important now, because of that question, to talk about the history and the ways that planning has been specifically used to reinforce discrimination. Everything from the size of the overpass not allowing buses through to keep bused Black people from the city from going to parks in New York, right? By telling these stories, you normalize talking about these things, making them visible, and in the context of how do we remedy, therefore. And I think part of the challenge and part of the way that privilege works is to make something so ubiquitous, so normalized for you that you no longer see it. So if I say, hey, did you talk to the guy in the lobby, the one in the checkered shirt? He was wearing, I think, khakis. The assumption is, generally speaking, that I'm probably talking about a white guy, because whiteness is normalized. And if anything had deviated from the norm, I would have pointed out his race. That is what I mean by the ubiquity of these things. And when we begin to reveal them, for example, Disney realized that a lot of the banter, a lot of the comedic banter of their performers supposed everyone's heterosexuality and supposed everybody's gender norms. And so they've changed their banter to make it so that it isn't a cringing experience that compels invisibility to people, but can still deliver a corny Disney-esque joke. So I want to, I think that right at this moment, when there's this great push to erase and to behave as though everything happened, you know, all planning decisions, where neighborhoods are, where the interstate came through and wiped out the Black business district and displaced, you know, generational wealth in Black communities is a persistent theme in every major urban area. Let's talk about it and not allow people to behave as though the drawing of that, you know, interstate was random. The placement of that high school, which took property from the Black community, was not accidental. It was all about the politics of what you could do to one group of people and not to white people. And so the more we make those things visible, the more we plant the seeds of a question that says, well, how are we doing that now? What does it look like now? How does it show up now? And how do we make up for the things that were normalized forms of planning-based discrimination? How do we remedy that? And now we've set the stage for a different kind of conversation about planning that doesn't pretend, it doesn't have the history that it has.
Thank you, Nadine. Now this is a question that, again, for the panelists. As queer planners, how do you find the courage to bring your full selves to work? I feel, I'm sorry, I'm missing. I feel, I think, and work in different, I'm trying to get all this together here, in a different way, partly attributed, oh gosh, I'm sorry, by, I'm trying to get all this in here. Let's start at the beginning part of it and I'll come back to it. But as queer planners, how do you find the courage to bring your full selves to work? Greg? You're muted, Greg. Oh, gosh.
Hey, there it is. Thank
Okay.
you, Bob. I appreciate that. Actually, that's a really good question. And that's a really good challenge. And that's something over time has taken me from, oh my God, I could never ever walk into work and say that I was a gay guy, to me being able to look at one of my elected officials while we're in China and say, you know, my partner is this, we're doing that. And that evolution of yourself, who you are as a person, is the thing that you have to be most comfortable with. So I think that that's the challenge that you have and where you are on that spectrum. Because when you walk in, and it's very liberating, it's probably one of the most liberating things you'll ever experience, is when you can walk in and just be who you are all the time. And you're not different when you go home. You're not different in your car. You're not different when you're out with your friends. You are just who you are. But that is a thing that takes time, and it also takes the ability to go, it doesn't matter what happens next, because I'm just going to face it. And that's the thing that I think is really kind of very cool in my own evolution. So that's your personal trip is going to be on that. I think Kate has something.
Yeah, Kate.
I would add to that. I totally agree with all of that. I want to add a little twist to that, though. As a person with a different perspective, you can eventually get to the point where you feel comfortable offering that different perspective. And sometimes it doesn't come off in this very personalized way. For example, when Nadine was mentioning overpasses and bus accessibility, I work in infrastructure in the private sector, and I can assure you that agencies that want money to build things don't necessarily have a whole lot of money, and there's not some big mysterious pot of money being handed out. And there's a lot of policy in place that allows for the selection in a competitive fashion as to whose projects are going to be built. And the idea of equity is important. So as someone who pays attention to this, I can help make sure that it's a conversation on the table, even if we're not specifically talking about the funding source, even if it's an engineering discussion, even if it's a discussion about landscape architecture. What makes a project, how does one prioritize a project? What makes a project important? So it's sort of depersonalized, but I would say it is this ability to take a perspective that I have and make it a strength, and it, it feels comfortable.
And if I could just jump in and say, evident research shows that the single thing that opens people's minds the most is knowing someone who's gay, lesbian, trans, or bisexual, or queer in some way, non-gender, non-normative. If people know people, they're more likely to go, oh, well, my cousin, my brother, my sister, my daughter, my father. That's how change happens. And so, yes, it's scary. Yes, it is. You may be at risk of losing a job, although in this day and age, probably not, though it still happens. But the thing to sort of steel your courage to is that if you want change to happen, you have to make that change happen by simply being yourself and bringing your whole self to the process. I did that when I transitioned at Florida State University, in the eyes, in public, in front of the 120 faculty and the thousands of students in the College of Social Sciences. And it was initially quite unpleasant. I was the person that everyone stared at for a week or two, and then something else happened, and other people became more interesting, and I just became Petra, that trans faculty member. And people came up to me and said, "You're the first trans person I've ever met." And that opens people's minds, that changes their thing. So think about that when you're considering it. But safety is an issue that you have to make that decision for yourself.
Greg.
And I just building on what Petra said, it's kind of like, it's that decision of safety. It's also that decision of, I can find another job. This might not be the place for me if it's going to become an issue. And that's something you need to find that right place to be. I mean, like I said, I work in this incredible place where my county administrator she is openly out with her partner, and they have kids. And my economic development person is openly out, and he has his family. And it's like we all actually get together and talk like every day is a normal day. And that's not the norm. And I recognize that, but find that safe place for yourself.
Thank you. And I'll just give my own perspective. Like I was saying, I started my career in Tallahassee, and I worked in Tallahassee from almost 20 years, so, professionally, from 89 to 2009. And at that time, Tallahassee was really a government town. And, in the late 80s and 90s, a lot of the planners that were working in Tallahassee, or any people else working in government, not a lot of people were out. And on top of it, the area in which I was working in a 9-county area that primarily surrounded Tallahassee-Leon County, some very North Florida communities. And I'm going to let your mind think about what a North Florida community can be. And what that is that I had to often as a planner, most often, I had to walk on eggshells, because how dare this Black guy stand in front of us and have something to say. And then if I was going to try to add to it, or my orientation, that was going to be a little bit more difficult. And there was the issues of safety. If you're traveling for 2 hours at 10 o'clock on a back road, you start thinking about certain things. And so but at some point, yes, you do consider safety. It may sound a little glib. It took me 20 years, but 20 years I moved. I moved to South Florida, and I can tell you that in that, the first, I even remember it was like this weight was lifted. And I remember my first meeting in South Florida. I literally sashayed in there. I was ready. And I was no longer concerned about people being in my tea because I was pouring it, I had brewed it, and I was go ahead and give you some sugar if you needed to go along with it. So at some point, yes, you can be concerned about your safety. I know that if you're in smaller communities with limited opportunities, you do have to think about those things. But I will also tell you that that oppressive weight is real, and it begins to affect you in ways that you're not seeing, and it will manifest in other ways. With that, what I'm going to do is turn to the panelists. We've got 5 minutes, and if you could each just give me like a 1 minute of just summation, and then we'll be able to close out. And before we do, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you again to the division for helping put this on. Thank you. I know our president, Wyatt, president of APA Florida, was on. Thank you, Wyatt, and the past presidents and the current presidents that have been supporting our EDI committee and with the work that we're doing. And so thank you for joining us. We'll get this posted and we'll let you know when it's up and where. And so with that, I'll start with Cade. We're gonna do a reverse order. Cade, just a couple of minutes, a minute, and then we'll go from there.
I'll be very brief. I want to make one plug for the EDI. Well, it's APA's broader initiative, but it is the Equity Priority Initiative. And this is something that's under development. And I would like for anyone who has any interest in any topic related to the community to consider how a record could be made of that. Consider oral histories, consider documentaries, consider anything that might be interesting, any story you believe there is to tell. And it doesn't have to be a history lesson. It can be right now because we're living it. So reach out to your friends and get back to us. I will happily provide any information.
Greg.
Awesome. Thank you. And I want to thank everybody online and those of you who are going to watch this later. This is good stuff. This is kind of why we're all in planning to begin with. And, there's a large number of us who are, just basically gone through our lives and had a chance, that oral history that we can share with you. And, I'm all there for everybody actually having that opportunity. So Bob, thank you for putting this together with APA and FAPA. But that said, I also want to kind of leave this out for everybody that's coming up in their careers. And you have to be active. You have to get out there and make sure people know what's going on, show empathy, show compassion, but also show strength. Because those three things will get your career where you need to go and your personal lives where they need to be, inclusive of what you do for a living. And with that, Bobby, back over to you.
Okay. Nadine, if you'll give us a minute and summarize, and then we'll go. I'm sorry, I may have to unmute you. Let me see here.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, there we go.
All right, wonderful. Thank you for inviting me. Everyone who's watching live or watching the recording, by all means, feel free to reach out, Nadine at equalityflorida.org. And I want to leave everyone with this because we've talked about how do you navigate fear. And, sometimes it's a privilege to be able to make choices about whether or not to navigate fear. And there's a lot of folks that don't get to make that decision. And oftentimes we look backwards and we ask ourselves, if I had lived during that period or in that era, I think I would have done the right thing. I think I would have made the hard choices. And I want to invite people to understand that we are in a moment like that now, and that we are each individually making choices. And for evil to prevail, it requires the silence of good people. And so I would say in this moment, pay attention to what is being asked of you. Pay attention to what it serves and where it comes into conflict with your professional ethics and your personal ethics, so that you can be somebody who will stand up in that moment and be in an integrity with who you say you are. Because we are on a very perilous, polarized path right now in America, and I believe it will get much worse before it gets better. And all of us have to do that gut check moment of, where do I stand and where will I speak? Or will I be one of those people who stands in the silence as these things unfold?
Thank you, Nadine. And Petra, if you'll close this out.
Okay, I think what I want to say is a couple things. One, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. And the reason I'm mad as hell are all the recent events that my fellow panelists have talked about. But the key is to turn that anger and fear, because there is fear as well, to a productive use. Get out, speak out, get involved, get organized, work with other groups. There are a lot of groups. And remember, as my t-shirt says, I think you can see, love conquers hate. You know, get out there and be yourself. Let your love shine through, because that's what's going to overcome. That's what persuades people. People don't react well to haters. People often react well to lovers. Let people see the love that flows through you, the power of your compassion, but don't let it silence your voices. Your voices are really, really important.
And with that, thank you, Petra. Again, thank you everyone for joining us. It's been I see Michelle. I'm gonna try very quickly. It's been a great moment. It's been a great day. I'm actually starting to tear up a little bit. So we're going to end it before you start seeing me blubbering on camera. But thanks again, everyone, for attending. And we hope to see you again soon. Reach out to us here at APA Florida's EDI committee if you need any help, assistance. Also reach out to Kate and the other colleagues at the division if you need any help, assistance, or support. Enjoy the rest of your day and have a marvelous week. Love you all.